a good time to talk about Richard Ewell's arrival here on the field. Ewell followed A.P. Hill's lead and made his way to the outskirts of Gettysburg, and when he got here, he sent his stepson Campbell Brown to find Robert E. Lee. If you were a Union soldier, it was plain for you to see that the Confederate artillery was unlimbering and positioning themselves right here on the knob of what's today known as Oak Hill. And if you were that Union soldier, you would also be seeing right about now Confederate skirmishers swarming down the hill toward you. It wouldn't be too hard to figure out that Richard and Dick Ewell's corps had arrived on the scene. Neither Ewell nor Rhodes realized it at the time, but they could not have arrived at a better time or place for the Army of Northern Virginia, because although not right away, their arrival would ultimately turn things around for Lee's army on that first day of the battle. The Union First Corps was exhausted from their fight over at McPherson's Ridge right across the field over the past 2 hours, and on the right flank, Lysander Cutler's brigade was terribly exposed. Union cavalry were the first to see these new players arrive on the field, and by 11 o'clock, Union outposts to the northwest reported long and strong lines of skirmishers backed by heavy columns of infantry over the hills and across these fields. When Rhodes and Ewell arrived on Oak Hill, they were surprised to say the least, because right here in front of them they saw that they could strike the Union forces that were engaged with A.P. Hill upon their right flank, because it was completely exposed. Arguably, if you're Rhodes or Ewell, you have every right to be excited. But there's a great lesson here in not being too impetuous in your actions and not allowing your enthusiasm to get in the way of your capabilities or sound practices. So, where was Robert E. Lee during all this time? Well, that's who Dick Ewell was looking for, just to get some good guidance. But Lee was on the other side of South Mountain and still issuing orders to coordinate the concentration of the Army of Northern Virginia between Cashtown and Gettysburg. Now, Campbell Brown did ultimately find Robert E. Lee, and he found him in Cashtown. Lee asked him where Jeb Stuart was. Brown really couldn't give him a precise answer, so Lee replied to him, "Very well, go back and remind General Ewell not to bring on a general engagement," because all of that is exactly what happened here. A courier from Heath arrived with the news that he had collided with the First Corps of the Army of the Potomac and made an urgent request to Hill, "Please send up support." So Hill rode up to see for himself, and when he arrived here, he was, by all accounts, disturbed and depressed. But to answer that question, where was Lee? Lee had moved his headquarters to Cashtown east of the mountains, and that morning he set off eastward on the Cashtown Pike with James Longstreet and Longstreet's lead division under Lafayette McLaws on the road behind. If all went well, by the end of the day, as Lee saw it, he'd have most of Hill's corps in Gettysburg, 2 of Ewell's divisions in Ashton, and Longstreet between Chambersburg and Cashtown, easy supporting distance from one another, ready to strike on Lee's command. Lee had not planned on meeting the Federals for at least another 24 hours, yet here they were in Gettysburg, and Lee had no idea what size it was. Later, Lee was able to understand that the Union infantry and artillery were present here in force. Lee's conclusion still, as he famously said, "I do not wish to bring on a general engagement today. Longstreet is not up." Without all of his infantry within close reach, Lee didn't want to run any risk of attacking the First Corps, only to discover that it was connected to the rest of the Army of the Potomac. So Lee would say to Heath, "Wait a while, and I will send you word when to go in." That was Lee's initial assessment, but the longer he thought about it, the more he received reports that the opportunity to crush the Federal Army one by one might be happening after all. There was no word yet that any other Union infantry were nearby. So, if you were Lee, that's important, because breaking off that action might send the wrong message to his own troops. Here, Heath's insistence that he should attack again showed his own confidence, and if you're Robert E. Lee, you really want to listen to your own commanders on the field. Right now, right about this time in the battle, there seemed to be far more Confederates than Yankees on the ground. Based on what he saw in front of him, Rhodes was absolutely convinced of his capabilities. He announced confidently to anybody who would listen, "I can burst through the enemy in an hour." But Rhodes made one mistake after the other on this morning. He maneuvered too quickly, and as a result, his isolated artillery batteries were completely splintered by an Ohio battery. So much so that one of Rhodes's battalion commanders asked Rhodes, "What damn fool put that battery out yonder?" What he didn't know is that Rhodes himself had placed it there. Nor did Rhodes take the usual precautions of deploying skirmishers, at least in any deliberate way, along the path of the planned advance. So none of his three brigade commanders knew at all what to expect. They were absolutely flying blind. The first of those brigades, the 26th Alabama Infantry Regiment under the command of Confederate Colonel E.A. O'Neill, bolted forward prematurely right into Henry Baxter's brigade, the brigade that Union General James Wadsworth had just placed there to protect Lysander Cutler's right flank. This was Edward O'Neill's report. "We were ordered forward, the 6th, the 12th, and the 26th Alabama regiments, and found the enemy strongly posted and in heavy force, and after a desperate and bloody fight of about a half an hour, we were compelled to fall back." So you can see how fast moving these maneuvers are and the effects of each of them has on the developing battle. But things would get much worse for the Confederates on this field before they'd get any better. Henry Baxter was a very blunt, rumpled, bearded miller from Michigan who was always getting wounded at Peninsula and Teedham and another time at Fredericksburg. He always seemed to bounce back. He was feisty, and he was steadily promoted all the way to brigadier general by March of 1863. He was a convinced abolitionist. His brigade was cobbled together right here. It was a bit ragtag, and their first fight was right here at Gettysburg. Just as Buford's Union horsemen were charging wildly right behind me, past the 97th, they shouted, "There are no troops behind you. You stand alone between the rebel army and your homes. Fight like hell." So, meanwhile, Iverson's brigade started forward without Iverson, who wanted to stay behind and watch. They swept grandly across Mummasburg Road right behind me. Henry Baxter and his men were waiting for them. The 97th hurled a deadly volley into the unprepared North Carolinians. A sheet of flame and smoke came from the wall. North Carolinians were toppled like rag dolls. Smoke became so dense you couldn't see an object 10 feet in front of you. And then Baxter yelled, "Up boys and give 'em steel." That initiated a bayonet charge by the 11th Pennsylvania and the 97th New York. Out of the 1,520 men that Iverson had started out with, 233 became POWs, 170 were dead, and 79 were lying in a straight line, perfectly dressed, right over here behind me. Iverson was described as an imbecile. The survivors of Iverson's brigade would never forgive Iverson for staying in the rear and never coming up. Lee relieved Iverson of command of his brigade for misconduct here at Gettysburg. The replies of O'Neill's Alabama brigade and the destruction of Iverson's North Carolinians left Junius Daniel's brigade moving ahead on its own uncovered. They walked blind into a blazing volley from the Union soldiers occupying the railroad cut right over there. They were cut down, all three ranks, in one firing.